black family, the Carters, moves into what appears to be an idyllic suburban neighborhood, known for its picturesque streets and tight-knit community. However, beneath the surface, tensions simmer. The Carters' decision to host a welcoming barbecue, hoping to break the ice and connect with their new neighbors, takes an unexpected turn when an older, long-time resident, Mrs. Adams, reacts with silent hostility. As the barbecue unfolds, tensions escalate, leading to a dramatic 911 call that triggers a police response. But when the officers arrive and recognize who they're dealing with, the entire neighborhood is left in shock. What happened at the Carters' barbecue that turned a simple get-together into a defining moment for the whole community? Before we dive into this tale of resilience and transformation, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you appreciate stories of redemption and community spirit, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss more inspiring narratives. Bookmark, go back. The Carter family was hopeful as they arrived at their new home on Sycamore Avenue. The suburb of Elmwood had a reputation for being the perfect place for families. Picturesque homes, safe streets, and neighbors who were often seen chatting from their front porches. From an outsider's view, Elmwood seemed like the embodiment of the American dream. Mark Carter, the newly appointed police chief, was a tall, confident man with an air of quiet authority. His rich brown skin and steady eyes hinted at the experiences that shaped him into a respected figure. Beside him, his wife, Rachel, exuded warmth and patience, qualities that made her adored as an elementary school teacher. Their children, 13-year-old Maya and 8-year-old Liam, were bundles of energy and curiosity, eager to explore the new house. As the Carters stepped out of their SUV and surveyed their charming 2-story home with its wraparound porch and spacious backyard, Rachel turned to Mark, her eyes glistening. "It's everything we wanted," she said, squeezing his hand. Mark nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "A fresh start," he replied, looking at Maya and Liam as they raced up the front steps. Unbeknownst to them, in a house across the street, a curtain moved as an elderly woman, Margaret Adams, observed the scene with a critical gaze. Margaret, a 40-year resident of Elmwood, saw herself as the community's self-appointed guardian. At 73, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and an impeccable wardrobe, she was known for her polite, albeit firm demeanor. To the untrained eye, Margaret appeared kind-hearted, yet beneath the surface, her disapproval of change was deeply rooted. Margaret's expression hardened as she whispered, "Another new family." "Just what we needed," her voice laced with sarcasm. She watched the Carters for a while longer, noting Mark's authoritative posture and Rachel's lively gestures as she laughed with the children. The knot in Margaret's chest tightened. They were not what she envisioned as typical Elmwood residents. A few days after the Carters settled in, Rachel stood outside planting flowers in the front yard. The warm sun made the petals of her bright marigolds seem to dance as she worked. It was then that Margaret, walking her tiny yappy poodle named Pebbles, decided it was time for an introduction. "Good morning," Margaret said, her voice clipped and formal. Rachel looked up, her face lighting up with a smile. "Good morning, you must be a neighbor. I'm Rachel Carter." Margaret nodded briefly. "Margaret Adams," she said. "I've lived here for decades." "It's so nice to meet you, Margaret. We're really excited to be here." "Elmwood seems like such a welcoming place," Rachel continued, undeterred by Margaret's icy tone. Margaret murmured, glancing at Rachel's flower bed with mild disapproval. "It's different now," she said, her gaze shifting to Rachel's eyes as if daring her to argue. Rachel's smile faltered but held firm. "Change can be good, don't you think?" she offered. Margaret's lips thinned into a line. "Perhaps," she said curtly. "Well, I should be going." "Good day, Mrs. Carter." "Good day, Margaret," Rachel replied, watching the older woman march away with Pebbles in tow, her back as rigid as the fence surrounding her immaculate garden. Rachel's heart sank as she turned back to her flowers, now slightly overshadowed by doubt. Her mind replayed the brief exchange. She shook off the feeling and resumed her planting, resolving not to let one chilly encounter overshadow their fresh start. Later that day, when Mark came home, Rachel recounted the meeting. He listened, nodding as she spoke, the faint lines on his brow deepening. "She wasn't exactly friendly," Rachel finished, the smile she forced failing to reach her eyes. Mark exhaled slowly. Some people need more time to come around. We just have to be patient. Bookmark. Rachel agreed, though a flicker of unease remained. Something about Margaret's stare felt less like indifference and more like a challenge. The days turned into weeks, and the Carters continued settling into their new routine. Mark started his demanding job at the police station, while Rachel focused on getting the kids acclimated to their new schools. Maya, with her outgoing nature, made friends quickly, sharing stories in the cafeteria and joining the art club. Liam, though quieter, was eager to share with his classmates the wonder of his new backyard treehouse. But amidst these promising beginnings, subtle signs suggested not everyone in Elmwood was enthusiastic about the new family. The Carters often noticed the sidelong glances when they jogged around the block, or the way conversations seemed to quiet as they approached. One Saturday afternoon, Mark decided to approach one of their neighbors, who was trimming a rose bush across the street. The man was stocky, middle-aged, and wore an old baseball cap. Mark put on a friendly smile as he walked over. "Hi there. I'm Mark Carter. We just moved in across the way." The neighbor looked up, his pruning shears pausing mid-snip. "Oh, hey," he said after a moment, his tone neutral. "I'm Bill Howard. Welcome to Elmwood." "Thanks, Bill. It's great to meet you," Mark continued, trying to ease the conversation. "We're really enjoying it so far. Beautiful area." Bill nodded slowly, his eyes darting over Mark's shoulder as if he expected someone to be watching. "Yeah, it's a nice place," he said, his voice trailing off. He offered a tight smile before bending back down to his roses, effectively ending the exchange. Mark's smile faded as he turned back toward his home. The unspoken tension hung in the air, heavier than he cared to admit. Rachel noticed his expression as he came up the driveway. "Another lukewarm welcome?" she asked softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yeah," Mark replied with a sigh. "It's as if they're waiting to see if we pass some invisible test." Rachel's eyes flickered with concern, but also a quiet determination. "Then we'll just have to show them who we really are," she said, squeezing his hand. One evening, the Carters decided it was time to host a small gathering, an opportunity to break through the polite but distant walls of their new neighbors. Rachel had the idea during a casual family chat over dinner. "What if we had a barbecue next weekend? Nothing fancy, just good food and a chance for people to stop by." Maya's eyes lit up. "Can I make invitations? We could put them in everyone's mailbox." Liam, quieter but just as eager, nodded enthusiastically. "We could have games too, like cornhole," he added, picturing himself playing with the neighborhood kids. Mark smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "I think it's a great idea. Let's do it." Over the next few days, Rachel and Maya worked together to create colorful, hand-drawn invitations. Rachel baked fresh cookies to go with each one, hoping that a sweet gesture would soften any hesitance. As they distributed the invitations, they were met with a range of reactions. Mrs. Wilson, an elderly lady with a garden full of lavender, was delighted and promised to bring her famous peach cobbler. A young couple down the street smiled and said they'd try to come, but some neighbors only offered polite nods, their expressions unreadable. The last stop was Margaret Adams' house. Rachel stood with Maya at the edge of the driveway, hesitating for a moment. "Ready?" she asked her daughter, who nodded with a bright smile. They walked up and rang the doorbell, the chime echoing through the quiet evening. Margaret opened the door slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in Rachel and Maya. "Yes," she said, her voice as crisp as ever. "Good evening, Mrs. Adams," Rachel began, holding out an invitation with one hand and a plate of cookies with the other. "We're having a barbecue this Saturday and would love for you to join us." Margaret's eyes flicked down to the invitation and back up. She didn't reach for it. "I'm not sure I'll be available," she said with a practiced smile, "but thank you for the thought." Maya's smile wavered, but Rachel stayed composed. "We'd love to have you, but we understand," she said, placing the cookies on a small table by the door. "Hope to see you there." Margaret nodded, her face unreadable as she closed the door. Rachel exchanged a look with Maya. "Sometimes people need more than an invitation," she said quietly, guiding her daughter back down the driveway. The anticipation of the barbecue grew, but so did the uncertainty about how it would be received. Bookmark. The day of the barbecue dawned sunny and warm. a perfect setting for an outdoor gathering. Mark fired up the grill early, ensuring that everything was ready. The aroma of marinated ribs and burgers wafted through the neighborhood, mingling with the scent of freshly baked bread and Rachel's famous potato salad. Maya and Liam ran around setting up a game station with beanbags and a small net for volleyball. Rachel smoothed down the gingham tablecloth she'd set up on the tables. A small knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach as she glanced at the street, still quiet, except for the occasional car passing by. "Do you think they'll come?" she asked Mark, who was testing the grill's heat. He gave her a reassuring smile. "Even if only a few show up, we're still putting ourselves out there. That's what matters." Soon, neighbors began to trickle in. Mrs. Wilson arrived first, true to her word, carrying a dish covered in aluminum foil. "I brought the cobbler," she announced with a warm smile. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Wilson," Rachel said, feeling a wave of relief. As more guests arrived, the mood lightened. A couple of young parents introduced themselves, and a trio of teenagers from down the block came by, attracted by the music Maya had chosen. Conversations began to bubble, and laughter occasionally rose above the hum of background chatter. Mark moved easily among the small groups, exchanging stories and making people feel at ease. However, there were still notable absences. Rachel's eyes wandered to Margaret's house. The curtains were drawn tightly, but she could almost feel the woman watching from behind them. Margaret's presence loomed over the event, even in her absence, like a storm cloud threatening an otherwise perfect day. Liam tugged on Rachel's sleeve, breaking her thoughts. "Mom, can we start the games now?" he asked, excitement sparkling in his eyes. Rachel glanced at the guests, seeing that they were settled in and relaxed. "Of course, go ahead," she said, smiling at his enthusiasm. As Liam and Maya gathered the neighborhood kids for a game of beanbag toss, Rachel felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a change. Bookmark. The barbecue was in full swing, laughter and music blending with the clink of glasses and the sizzle of food. For a few hours, it felt like the Carters had broken through the cautious distance of their new neighbors. Mark's deep, hearty laugh could be heard from the grill as he swapped stories with a few dads. Rachel circulated with a tray of lemonade, accepting compliments on her cooking with a modest smile. Meanwhile, in her dimly lit living room across the street, Margaret watched with a mixture of resentment and disbelief. To her, this gathering was more than just a neighborhood event. It was an unwelcome intrusion. She paced the room, Pebbles watching from his little dog bed as her frustration boiled over. Finally, unable to contain herself, Margaret reached for the phone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed. 911, what's your emergency? Came the steady voice of the dispatcher. Margaret put on a tone of concern. Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance. There's a lot of noise coming from my neighbor's house, and I'm worried there might be trouble. The dispatcher asked a few routine questions, and Margaret, careful to sound genuine, spoke of loud music, shouting, and a crowd of unfamiliar people. I don't know who these people are, she added, voice dropping conspiratorially. It's usually such a quiet neighborhood. The dispatcher assured her that officers would be sent to investigate, and Margaret hung up, a twisted satisfaction settling over her. She returned to her post by the window, eyes fixed on Carter's lively backyard, waiting for the moment she anticipated would disrupt the gathering. Back at the barbecue, Rachel felt a chill run down her spine as she noticed the approaching squad car, its flashing lights casting a harsh glow against the dusky sky. Mark saw it too, and the change in his expression was immediate. The laughter around them dulled as guests turned to look, their curiosity tinged with anxiety. Why are the police here? Maya whispered to Liam, who only shrugged, eyes wide with confusion. Mark took a deep breath, steadying himself before striding toward the driveway. The two officers stepped out, their faces neutral but surprised when they recognized him. Evening, Chief Carter, one said, his tone suddenly respectful. Evening, Mark replied evenly. What seems to be the issue? The officer shifted awkwardly, glancing at his notes. We received a call about a noise disturbance and suspicious activity, he said, the words sounding almost absurd given the scene. Rachel joined Mark, her face pale but composed. We're just having a neighborhood barbecue, she said, her voice shaking slightly as she gestured to the tables and chatting guests. The officers exchanged glances, their earlier tension dissipating as they took in the sight of kids playing and neighbors mingling. "We just need to look around briefly, Chief. Standard procedure," one said, his tone apologetic. Mark nodded, stepping aside. "Go ahead." The officers did a quick walkthrough, their faces increasingly sheepish as they confirmed there was no issue. The silence was palpable as the guests watched the officers finish their check and return to Mark. "Everything's fine here," the lead officer finally said. "Sorry for the inconvenience." Mark's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Thank you for checking," he replied, his voice controlled. As the officers left, the chatter resumed, quieter this time, the carefree atmosphere tainted by the shadow of suspicion that had been cast. Margaret's satisfaction turned to confusion as she watched from her window, realizing that the scene had played out far differently than she had imagined. Bookmark. As the police car disappeared down the street, an uneasy silence hovered over the backyard. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at their phones, others exchanging awkward looks. Rachel forced a smile as she approached a few of the attendees, trying to recapture the warmth from earlier. "It's okay, everyone," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "It was just a misunderstanding." Mrs. Wilson patted Rachel's arm gently. "Don't you worry, dear. We know who you are and why we're here. This won't change that." Her words brought a flicker of reassurance, though Rachel's heart still ached with embarrassment and anger. Mark, meanwhile, stood by the grill, eyes scanning the crowd and the surrounding houses. His gaze lingered on Margaret's window, where the curtain had been drawn back ever so slightly. The faint outline of her figure suggested that she'd been watching, a spectator to the disruption she'd orchestrated. Mark's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to look away. Giving in to anger would solve nothing. "Dad, why did the police come?" Maya asked, tugging at his arm with wide, searching eyes. Mark looked down at his daughter, the questions in her eyes mirroring the questions in his heart. "Someone made a mistake, sweetie," he said, crouching to her level. "But it's all taken care of now." Rachel joined them, placing a steadying hand on Mark's shoulder. "Why don't you two go play for a while?" she suggested to Maya and Liam. They hesitated, then nodded and ran off to join the other kids, their laughter returning, but not quite as carefree as before. The rest of the barbecue passed in a strained quiet. Guests lingered for a while, offering kind words and supportive smiles before taking their leave. As the last neighbor waved goodbye, Mark and Rachel were left standing in their yard, the echoes of the evening still rippling through their minds. "We tried," Rachel whispered, her voice tinged with defeat. "We did more than try," Mark said, pulling her close. "And we'll keep trying. This is just the beginning." Across the street, Margaret sat in her dim living room, her earlier satisfaction replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. She hadn't expected the Carters to handle the situation with such grace or for their guests to stay and show support. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind, a small crack in the wall she'd built to keep change at bay. The next morning, news of the barbecue incident had spread through Elmwood. Conversations buzzed in coffee shops and on front porches, each version of the story more speculative than the last. Some neighbors were sympathetic, criticizing whoever had called the police, while others murmured about the disruption and how things had been so different before the Carters arrived. Rachel overheard snippets of these conversations as she walked Liam to school. The glances that met her eyes were now less indifferent and more layered with curiosity or judgment. She kept her chin high, greeting those she passed with a polite nod, determined not to let whispers shake her resolve. At work, Mark faced a similar situation. He walked into the station, feeling the shift in the atmosphere the moment he stepped inside. Some officers gave him an extra nod of respect, their eyes showing silent support. Others exchanged subtle looks that he couldn't quite decipher. The incident had made its way back to the precinct, and Mark could sense the different interpretations of it settling into the minds of those around him. As the day wore on, Mark received a message from an unexpected sender, Mrs. Wilson. It was short but meaningful. "Don't let this shake you. Elmwood needs people like you and Rachel." The words buoyed him, a reminder that not everyone saw them as outsiders. Meanwhile, Margaret received her own share of attention. A few of the older residents had called her, some curious, others concerned about how the neighborhood was changing. One friend, Jeanette, an equally long-term resident, mentioned in passing, "I heard the Carters handled things quite well, actually. Maybe we should give them a chance." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. She brushed off the comment with a tight, practiced smile, but her mind lingered on it long after the conversation ended. The clear lines she had once drawn between her and the Carters were beginning to blur. The thought unsettled her. The week after the barbecue, Rachel decided to be proactive. She suggested that they organize a community meeting for Mark. "It could be a way to clear the air and get to know more people," she said, her voice filled with cautious hope. Mark agreed, sensing that moving forward was the only option. They began planning, reaching out to neighbors both new and familiar, hoping that even those like Margaret would show up. It was a gamble, but one they were willing to take. And so, with flyers printed and handed out, the Carters awaited the day of the meeting, not knowing whether it would bring the community together or deepen the divide. Bookmark. The evening of the community meeting arrived, and the recreation center's hall was set up with rows of chairs facing a modest podium. Mark and Rachel stood by the entrance, greeting neighbors as they trickled in. Some offered warm smiles and words of support, while others entered with guarded expressions, as if unsure what to expect. Maya and Liam sat in the front row, glancing around with curiosity. Rachel had arranged for coffee and cookies on a table at the back of the room, hoping that the simple gesture might encourage conversation. The room slowly filled with a mix of residents, young parents, retirees, and a handful of teenagers leaning against the walls with folded arms. Mark scanned the gathering, spotting Mrs. Wilson sitting with a few friends. She gave him an encouraging nod. To his surprise, Margaret was there, sitting near the back with an expression that bordered on defiance and curiosity. It was a small victory that she had come at all. Mark stepped up to the podium, the low murmur of conversation quieting as he began to speak. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight," he said, his voice steady but warm. "Rachel and I wanted to hold this meeting because we believe that open dialogue is the first step toward understanding." He paused, letting the silence deepen as he scanned the room. "Many of you know there was an incident during our barbecue last week. A call was made and the police responded. I want to start by saying that my role as police chief is to ensure the safety of everyone in this community, including my own family. But it's important that we acknowledge why that call might have been made in the first place." Rachel's eyes swept the room, catching a few heads nodding in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mark continued, "Elmwood has always been known for being a welcoming place, a neighborhood where people feel safe and connected. But that reputation doesn't mean we don't have room to grow. Change can be unsettling, but it's also an opportunity." The words hung in the air as Mark stepped back, opening the floor for questions and comments. For a moment, no one spoke, the weight of the past week heavy in the room. Finally, Mrs. Wilson stood up, clearing her throat. "I just want to say, Chief Carter, that this meeting is exactly what we needed. I've been here for 30 years, and while we cherish our traditions, it's time we acknowledge that a strong community is one that welcomes everyone." Applause rippled through the room, hesitant at first but growing as others joined in. Margaret's face tightened, but she remained silent. Her eyes locked on Mark. As the applause died down, a younger man named Alex, who had moved to Elmwood 5 years earlier, stood up. He shifted his weight nervously before speaking. "I think we all know that there's been a divide, even if we don't talk about it. What happened at the barbecue just made it more obvious. But we need to ask ourselves why that is." A murmur passed through the room, a collective recognition of the truth in Alex's words. Mark nodded, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face. Then, unexpectedly, Margaret rose from her seat. The room tensed, eyes turning to her as she took a deep breath, her fingers clutching the back of the chair in front of her. "I want to say something," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 4 decades. I've seen changes that I didn't always agree with, and I admit that I've held on to those feelings tightly." The silence was absolute, the air heavy with anticipation. Margaret's gaze moved from the floor to Mark, then to Rachel. "I made the call that night," she said, her voice cracking but steady. Gasps rippled through the room. Rachel's eyes widened, her hand flying to her chest, but she stayed quiet, letting Margaret speak. Margaret's face flushed with emotion. "I thought I was protecting something, the idea of what this neighborhood used to be. But I see now that holding on to that has made me blind to what it can become. I'm sorry for what I did, truly." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. Mark met her eyes, a complex mix of emotions passing over his face before he nodded. "Thank you for your honesty, Margaret," he said, his voice both firm and kind. "Acknowledging our actions is the first step, but what we do next is even more important." The tension in the room began to dissolve as neighbors whispered to each other. Mrs. Wilson, always quick to bridge gaps, stood up again. "I think we all have something to learn from this. The Carters have shown us what resilience and openness look like. Maybe it's time we all follow their example." Rachel felt the tightness in her chest ease for the first time in days. The conversation that followed was a blend of apologies, promises, and tentative ideas for how to rebuild trust. As the meeting continued, more voices joined in. Neighbors who had been silent started to share their own experiences and thoughts. A young mother, Caroline, stood up with her toddler balanced on her hip. "I moved here for the same reason most of us did. For safety, for community. But community isn't just about who's been here the longest. It's about who's willing to show up, to contribute, and to care. And that's exactly what the Carters have done." Nods of agreement spread through the room, and Rachel felt a warm tear slip down her cheek. She reached over and grasped Mark's hand, their fingers intertwining in a silent show of unity. Margaret sat back in her chair, eyes lowered as if absorbing each word like a hard truth. The shift in her expression hinted at a realization dawning, one that she had fought against for so long. She looked up, glancing at Rachel and Mark, who caught her eye and offered a subtle nod. It was a moment of shared acknowledgement, a sign that change, though difficult, was possible. The conversation moved forward with suggestions for how the neighborhood could foster better connections. Mark proposed the idea of organizing regular neighborhood events, potlucks, game nights, and volunteer days. "It doesn't have to be big," he said, a hopeful smile touching his lips. "But it's a way to make sure we're seeing each other beyond just waves from the driveway." Wilson raised her hand. "What about a neighborhood project? Something we all contribute to, like a community garden. It would be a place where everyone could meet, work together, and share the rewards." Excited murmurs swept through the hall. Rachel's eyes lit up as she turned to Mark. "That's perfect," she whispered. Margaret, still sitting near the back, surprised everyone by speaking up. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said, her voice hesitant but sincere. "I'd like to help organize it." This time, the room erupted in applause, the sound echoing with newfound hope. Mark and Rachel exchanged glances, their hearts lighter than they had been in weeks. The ice had cracked, revealing the potential for real change beneath. In the days following the meeting, a buzz of activity swept through Elmwood. Rachel and Mark worked with a small group of neighbors to outline a plan for the community garden. Flyers were distributed, inviting everyone to a planning session at the local park. This time, there was a tangible shift in the air, a cautious excitement, as if the neighborhood was holding its breath, ready to see if they could make this newfound unity last. On a warm Saturday morning, residents gathered at the park, folding chairs and picnic blankets, dotting the green space. Mark stood at the front with Rachel, who was holding a binder full of notes and sketches. Even Margaret was there, sitting with Mrs. Wilson and offering a tentative smile when Rachel caught her eye. "Thank you all for coming," Rachel began, her voice carrying a warmth that made people lean in. "This garden is more than just a project. It's a way for us to connect, to work together, and share something positive." Maya and Liam sat nearby, watching their parents with pride. Maya whispered to Liam, "I think this is going to be really cool," and Liam nodded, already picturing himself digging in the dirt and planting flowers. Neighbors shared ideas on what to include in the garden: a vegetable patch for fresh produce, a section for flowers that would attract bees and butterflies, and even a small corner where children could plant their own seeds. Volunteers signed up to help with everything from preparing the soil to gathering donations for tools and seeds. Margaret raised her hand. When Mark called on her, she stood, clearing her throat nervously. "I'd like to suggest we add a bench or two, so people can come and sit, enjoy the space, and talk," she said, glancing at Rachel as she spoke. Rachel's smile widened. "That's a great idea, Margaret. Thank you." As the meeting ended, neighbors lingered, talking about their plans and swapping stories. The barriers that had once felt insurmountable were beginning to fall. The simple act of planning something together was working its quiet magic, drawing people closer in a way that hadn't happened before. Margaret approached Mark and Rachel as they packed up their things. She hesitated, then extended a hand. "I know it'll take more than words, but I meant what I said at the meeting. I want to help make this right." Mark shook her hand firmly, a genuine smile on his face. "Actions speak volumes, Margaret, and this is a good start." Rachel nodded, feeling hope bloom inside her. "We're glad to have you with us." The foundation had been laid, and now it was time to build. Bookmark. The morning the community came together to break ground on the new garden was vibrant and full of energy. The sun cast a warm glow over Elmwood Park, where neighbors arrived carrying gardening tools, buckets, and wheelbarrows. Children ran excitedly between parents, chattering about the plants they wanted to grow. For the first time, it felt like Elmwood was truly alive, with a shared purpose. Mark and Rachel stood side by side, welcoming volunteers and coordinating the setup. "We need to clear the land first," Mark announced, gesturing to a patch of grass marked with small flags. "Once that's done, we'll start tilling the soil." Margaret was among the volunteers, dressed in a simple work shirt and gloves. It was a stark contrast to the crisp blouses she usually wore, but it suited her newfound role. She picked up a spade and joined a group that included Mrs. Wilson and Alex, the young man who had spoken candidly at the meeting. Rachel glanced over, catching Margaret's determined expression as she worked. It was a sight that filled her with cautious optimism. The garden was already serving its purpose, breaking barriers that once seemed impenetrable. As the morning progressed, people shared stories and laughter over the hum of shovels and rakes. Maya and Liam found themselves in a group of kids setting up a small area where they could plant flowers. "Look, Mom," Maya called out, holding a packet of wildflower seeds. Rachel waved back, her smile wide and genuine. Margaret paused her digging to watch the scene unfold, the sound of children's laughter mingling with the chatter of adults. For a moment, she felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years, as if the distance she'd kept from others had been replaced by a sense of belonging. She shook her head lightly, amazed at how different things had become in such a short time. As the last section of soil was tilled, Mark called for everyone's attention. "Thank you for being here today. This is just the first step, but it's a big one. It shows that we're capable of not just living side by side, but truly working together." A round of applause followed, more spirited than tentative. Rachel stepped forward, holding up a young tomato plant. "Let's get planting." Bookmark. Go back. Over the following weeks, the garden began to take shape. Raised beds were built, paths were laid with gravel, and the first plants went into the soil. The project attracted attention from those who hadn't initially been involved. They stopped by to see the progress, often staying to help or chat with neighbors. The garden had become a gathering point, an emblem of unity in a community that once felt fragmented. Margaret, true to her word, came regularly to assist. She planted marigolds near the edges of the garden to ward off pests and chatted with Rachel about different plant types. Though their conversations started with the weather or gardening tips, they soon ventured into stories about their families and shared memories of Elmwood over the years. "I used to bring my son here when he was little," Margaret mentioned one afternoon, her voice softening with nostalgia. "He would climb the old oak tree over there." She pointed to a tree that still stood proudly near the edge of the park. Rachel nodded, glancing at Liam, who was helping another boy water the plants. "Maybe one day he'll bring his kids to see this garden," Rachel said, her voice full of hope. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She swallowed hard and smiled. "I think he would have liked that." The changes didn't go unnoticed. Even those who had initially stayed away from the barbecue and the meeting began to visit the garden. They brought seeds, donated benches, or simply sat on the new benches Margaret had suggested, watching the community come together. The garden was not just about plants. It had become a space for conversations, forgiveness, and new beginnings. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light over the town, Mark and Rachel walked through the rows of growing vegetables and flowers. They stopped at the section Maya and Liam had planted. Bright wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze, vibrant and full of life. "It's beautiful," Rachel whispered, leaning into Mark's shoulder. "It is," Mark agreed, "and it's just the start." Across the garden, Margaret sat on one of the benches, looking out at the scene with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She glanced at Mark and Rachel, meeting their eyes with a small nod. It was an acknowledgement, not just of her past mistakes, but of the new path forward they had all chosen to walk together. The seeds of change had been planted, and now it was time to nurture them. As summer turned to fall, Elmwood Park and its thriving community garden became the heart of the neighborhood. Neighbors came regularly, tending to their sections, sharing gardening tips, and enjoying each other's company. The initial tensions that had once defined the Carters' arrival now felt like a distant memory. To celebrate the garden's success and the newfound unity in the community, Rachel and Mark proposed a harvest festival. The idea caught on quickly, with residents volunteering to help organize activities, set up booths, and contribute dishes featuring the garden's produce. Flyers went up around town, and word spread that this event would be a celebration of everything the community had worked for. The day of the festival was perfect, crisp, sunny, and full of autumn colors. Tables were arranged with vibrant displays of vegetables picked from the garden. Baskets of tomatoes, squash, cucumbers, and peppers gleamed under the sunlight. Children's laughter rang through the park as they played games, and a local musician strummed cheerful tunes that carried on the cool breeze. Maya and Liam had volunteered to help with face painting, a job they took on with unbridled enthusiasm. "Look, Mom," Maya called out as she painted a butterfly on a young girl's cheek. Rachel laughed, her heart swelling with pride. Margaret arrived, carrying a tray of homemade zucchini bread, and made her way over to the refreshment table. A few months earlier, such an act of participation would have seemed unimaginable. Now, it felt natural. She caught sight of Rachel and waved. Rachel waved back, then walked over. "I see you brought something special," Rachel said, her tone warm. Margaret smiled, lines around her eyes softening. "It's a recipe my grandmother used to make. I thought it would be fitting." "It's perfect," Rachel replied, placing a reassuring hand on Margaret's arm. Nearby, Mark stood talking to Alex and Mrs. Wilson, who was organizing a small farmer's market booth. "This is exactly what I hoped for," Alex said, nodding toward the crowd of chatting neighbors. Mark smiled, the tension he'd once carried in his shoulders completely absent. "Me too," he said. "It's good to see what happens when people come together." As the day went on, the garden served not just as a backdrop, but as a testament to what could be accomplished when a community set aside its differences. Neighbors who had once exchanged only polite nods now laughed together, swapping recipes and sharing stories about their families. Margaret found herself standing at one of the benches she had suggested months ago, watching as children played tag around the raised beds. She spotted Maya and Liam racing each other to the makeshift petting zoo, and smiled at their carefree joy. As the festival continued into the evening, the warm glow of string lights illuminated the park, casting a golden hue over the faces of the neighbors gathered there. Music drifted softly from the stage, where a local band played a mix of folk and classic rock. The scent of spiced cider and freshly baked bread filled the air, blending with the crisp autumn leaves. Margaret sat on the bench, a cup of cider in her hands, and watched the scene before her. It was impossible not to reflect on how far the community had come. She remembered the way she had felt that day at her window, the surge of frustration and control that had driven her to call the police. The memory stung, but the warmth surrounding her now softened the regret. Rachel joined her on the bench, holding 2 plates of food. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, her smile bright in the soft light. Margaret shook her head, a hint of emotion in her eyes. "Please do." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the sound of laughter and conversation filling the spaces between them. Finally, Margaret turned to Rachel, her voice low and sincere. "I owe you and your family more than just an apology." Rachel met her eyes, seeing the vulnerability there. "You've done more than apologize, Margaret. You showed up. You helped build this garden and everything it stands for." Margaret took a sip of her cider, the steam curling up into the cool evening air. "I never thought I could change my mind about what this place should be. But watching everyone here tonight, I realize it's so much better than I ever imagined." Rachel nodded, looking out over the garden where Liam was now showing Mrs. Wilson his prized sunflower. "That's the thing about community. It grows best when we care for it together." Margaret smiled, a genuine, heartfelt expression that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Rachel, for everything." As the night wound down and people began to gather their things, Mark stood up on the small stage to address the crowd one last time. "Thank you all for making this day so special," he said, his voice filled with pride. "This garden, this festival, all of it, is because of you. It's proof that when we come together, we can create something truly lasting." The crowd erupted in applause, with cheers echoing into the night. Margaret joined in, clapping until her hands were warm and her heart felt full. The festival had not just celebrated a successful season in the garden. It marked a turning point, a reminder that change, though difficult, was always worth pursuing. And as the last of the string lights twinkled against the dark sky, Elmwood's residents walked away with a shared promise to continue nurturing what they had built together. In the months that followed the Harvest Festival, the community garden flourished, becoming a focal point for life in Elmwood. The change was tangible. Neighbors who had once been strangers now shared cups of coffee on Sunday mornings as they checked on their plants. Children raced each other down the garden paths, laughter filling the air. The Carters had become more than just the new family on Sycamore Avenue. They were known as the ones who had brought something fresh and vital to the neighborhood. Mark and Rachel continued to lead by example. Mark hosted monthly meet and greets at the police station, a gesture that bridged the gap between law enforcement and residents. These gatherings fostered open conversations where people could voice their concerns and learn more about community safety. Rachel started a gardening club that met every other week to discuss seasonal planting and host workshops. Margaret was a regular attendee, offering advice with the same determination that once marked her resistance. "If you plant marigolds next to your tomatoes, you'll keep the bugs at bay," she said one evening, her voice steady and warm. The others nodded, taking notes and exchanging smiles. Maya and Liam thrived in this new atmosphere. Maya, who had once been hesitant to talk about her family's experiences, wrote an essay for school titled, "How a Garden Grew Our Community." It earned her first place in a district-wide writing contest and was published in the local paper, bringing smiles to faces across town. Liam, on the other hand, loved showing new friends the sunflower patch, which had become a popular spot for taking family photos. One chilly morning, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the local newspaper. The headline caught her eye, "Elmwood's Community Garden, a Symbol of Unity." She read the article, a smile growing as she took in the stories of neighbors who had shared their experiences. Some mentioned how they'd made unexpected friendships, while others spoke about learning to overcome old prejudices. It felt like a culmination of everything they had hoped for and more. Mark entered the kitchen, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. "What's got you smiling like that?" he asked, leaning over her shoulder to glance at the paper. Rachel pointed to the headline, and Mark's grin widened as he read. "Looks like we did it," he said, pride in his voice. Rachel nodded, eyes misting. "It wasn't just us, it was everyone." Mark placed a gentle kiss on her forehead. "Yeah, but it started with you and me taking that first step." Winter settled over Elmwood, draping the garden in frost and casting a serene stillness across the neighborhood. Despite the season's quiet, the connections that had been nurtured during the warmer months endured. Neighbors continued to check in on one another, helping to shovel snow or sharing warm bowls of stew. The garden itself, though dormant, remained a symbol of the change that had taken root. Margaret often visited the garden even in the cold, sitting on the bench she had once suggested. Wrapped in a thick coat and scarf, she would watch the bare branches sway in the wind and think about the past year. The Carters' arrival had challenged her view of the world, but they had also shown her that change wasn't something to fear. It could bring growth, not just for a garden, but for a person's heart. One afternoon, Rachel spotted Margaret in the garden and decided to join her. The crunch of snow underfoot announced her approach, and Margaret looked up with a small smile. "Mind if I sit?" Rachel asked, breath clouding the air between them. "Not at all," Margaret replied, patting the empty space beside her. They sat in silence for a few moments, watching as a few snowflakes began to fall. Rachel finally spoke. "Do you remember when we first met? You told me that change could be difficult." Margaret chuckled softly, the sound mixing with the rustle of the wind. "I do. And I suppose I was right, but not in the way I thought." Rachel turned to face her. "But look at what came from it. All of this," she said, gesturing to the snow-covered garden, its structure a quiet testament to their shared work. Margaret's eyes glistened, and she reached over to place a gloved hand on Rachel's. "Thank you for not giving up on us, on me." Rachel squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for choosing to be part of this. It wouldn't have been the same without you." As they sat together, the wind carried the distant sound of children playing, their voices bright and joyful. It was a reminder that the seeds they had planted were more than just plants. They were the foundation for a community that had learned to embrace its differences and grow stronger for it. Winter would pass and spring would come again, bringing new life to the garden and the people who tended it. The Carters knew that there would always be challenges, but they also knew that they had found their place in Elmwood, a place they would continue to help flourish for years to come. As winter gradually loosened its grip, the first signs of spring hinted at a new beginning. Crocuses and daffodils pushed their way through patches of snow, and neighbors began to wander back into the garden, eager to prepare for the new season. The garden was a powerful reminder that even after the coldest winters, life would return, vibrant and full of promise. Mark stood at the edge of the garden one morning, watching the first rays of sunlight illuminate the rows of raised beds. He spotted Liam skipping toward him, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Dad, can we plant the sunflowers again this year?" Liam asked, eyes wide with anticipation. Mark ruffled his son's hair, nodding. "Absolutely, buddy. This garden wouldn't be complete without them." Behind them, Rachel was chatting with a group of neighbors who had gathered to discuss spring planting plans. Margaret was among them, her laughter mingling with the others as she shared an anecdote about her first gardening mistake. The bond she had formed with the Carters had become a cornerstone of her days, and it seemed like her world had expanded in ways she hadn't thought possible. Maya, now more confident and comfortable in her surroundings, walked up to Rachel holding a notebook. "Mom, I had an idea," she said, flipping through her notes. "What if we start a neighborhood newsletter? We could write about gardening tips and community events, and even spotlight people who have done cool things around town." Rachel's eyes lit up. "That's a fantastic idea, Maya. It would be a great way to keep everyone connected." Margaret, overhearing, chimed in, "I'd be happy to contribute. Maybe a column about gardening from an old-timer's perspective?" She winked, drawing laughter from those nearby. Mark felt a swell of pride as he watched his family and neighbors chat and plan. Elmwood had evolved into a place where differences were embraced and everyone's voice was valued. The Carters had set out to find a home, but they had found something much more profound, a community willing to grow alongside them. Bookmark. The garden blossomed once more, its rows filled with vegetables, herbs, and flowers that painted the park in a spectrum of greens, yellows, and reds. It became a symbol not only of resilience, but of collaboration and trust. Elmwood was no longer just a collection of houses on a tree-lined street. It was a true neighborhood where bonds had deepened. The newsletter, spearheaded by Maya, launched with a warm reception. Its first issue featured an article about the history of the community garden and a story by Mrs. Wilson about her favorite recipes using fresh herbs. Margaret's column, titled "The Old Gardener's Corner," shared practical tips and tales from her early days in Elmwood. Each piece was a small testament to how the community had shifted from wary glances to shared smiles. One day, as Mark and Rachel walked hand in hand through the bustling garden, they paused to take in the sight of children helping their parents plant seeds, older residents giving pointers to newcomers, and teens tending to their own plots, with music playing softly in the background. "This is what we dreamed of," Rachel said, squeezing Mark's hand. "A place where everyone feels they belong." Mark nodded, taking a deep breath of the fragrant air. "And we built it together. This garden is as much theirs as it is ours." At that moment, Margaret approached with a small pot in her hands. She had nurtured a rare flower known for its vibrant purple blossoms, and now she offered it to Mark and Rachel. "I thought this would be a beautiful addition," she said, her voice carrying a mix of pride and warmth. Rachel's eyes misted over as she took the pot. "Thank you, Margaret. It's perfect." The flower found a place near the center of the garden where everyone could admire its beauty. As the sun set, casting golden and pink hues across the park, the residents gathered one last time to celebrate their collective efforts. Music played, children danced, and adults mingled with contentment evident on their faces. Margaret sat at one of the benches, watching the scene unfold. A soft smile rested on her lips as she reflected on how far they all had come. What had begun as resistance to change had evolved into an embrace of it. The Carters had brought with them the seeds of something transformative, but it was the entire community's willingness to nurture those seeds that made Elmwood what it was now, a neighborhood bound not by tradition alone, but by empathy and shared purpose. As twilight deepened, Mark stood and lifted his glass, inviting the neighbors to join him. "To Elmwood," he said, his voice strong and full of emotion. "May we continue to grow together, season after season." "To Elmwood," echoed the crowd, their voices blending into a single harmonious cheer. And so, with the stars beginning to twinkle above and the laughter of children filling the night, the Carters knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. Home, in a community they had helped to bloom. As years passed, the garden at Elmwood Park became more than just a symbol of unity. It grew into a cherished legacy, shared by all who lived in the neighborhood. Each season brought new faces to the community, some moving in to take up residence in Elmwood, and others, visitors from nearby towns, curious about the renowned garden that had transformed a neighborhood. Maya, now in her late teens, took on more responsibility, leading the gardening club her mother had started. She found joy in teaching younger children how to plant seeds and care for them, passing on what she had learned from her parents and neighbors. Liam, taller and more confident, helped organize events at the garden, ensuring that it continued to be a space where everyone felt welcome. Margaret, now considered one of Elmwood's most beloved residents, was often found at her usual bench, offering advice and encouragement to new gardeners. Her column in the neighborhood newsletter had become a favorite, filled with stories that wove history, humor, and lessons learned from her long life. One spring day, Mark and Rachel watched from the edge of the garden as Maya led a group of children in planting new sunflowers, a continuation of the tradition Liam had started years ago. Rachel turned to Mark, a proud smile playing on her lips. "Look at them, carrying on everything we hoped for." Mark nodded, the warmth of the moment settling over him. "It's amazing, isn't it, how one step, one choice can lead to something this lasting." Nearby, Margaret caught their eye and waved them over. When they reached her, she chuckled softly. "You know, I never thought a simple garden could mean so much," she said, "but it has changed all of us." Rachel took Margaret's hand. "And it will keep changing us, long after we're gone." The garden flourished, season after season, as new residents added their own touches and stories to its legacy. Elmwood's story became one of resilience, unity, and hope, a reminder that even in the face of challenges, when a community comes together with open hearts and hands, it can create something truly beautiful and enduring. And so, under the gentle glow of the sun and the rustling leaves, Elmwood thrived. Racist neighbor calls cops on black family's BBQ, but the father is the new police chief. A living testament to the power of community, where the seeds of compassion and understanding The journey of the Carter family and the transformation of Elmwood is more than just a story of moving to a new neighborhood. It's a testament to the power of community, resilience, and the willingness to embrace change. From the initial challenges they faced, marked by quiet skepticism and outright resistance, to the eventual unity fostered by shared goals, the Carters showed that true change starts with courage and a commitment to doing what's right, even when it's hard. One of the biggest lessons from this story is that progress is not instantaneous. It requires patience, understanding, and active participation from everyone involved. Mark and Rachel's journey emphasize that real growth comes when people are willing to step outside their comfort zones, engage in honest conversations, and recognize that diversity enriches a community. Margaret's transformation was equally significant. She reminded us that it's never too late to change one's perspective. Her journey from being the primary source of tension to becoming an integral part of the community demonstrates that even those who resist change the most can find redemption and joy in embracing it. Elmwood's story also highlights the importance of symbols like the community garden. It stood not just as a plot of land, but as a living embodiment of cooperation, care, and shared purpose. It taught the residents that unity is nurtured through shared experiences and small acts of kindness. The garden became a place where stories were told, friendships were formed, and future generations learned to appreciate the value of a community that grows together. In essence, this story shows that even when faced with prejudice or hesitation, persistence in fostering connection can turn a community into more than just a collection of houses. It becomes a family. If you found this story touching, please comment with the number 1. If it resonated with you deeply, comment with the number 2. We'd love to hear about your own experiences of overcoming challenges or building connections in your community. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring stories. Share your thoughts about this story in the comments below.